Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us at our first SABSA Perspectives webinar series. I'm going to hand over to Dean and Director John Foster-Pedley to open the webinar for us. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Memo. I really appreciate that. And it's an absolute privilege for us at Henley to be able to host this conversation by some phenomenal panelists, excluding me, about the conversation around corruption. It's such a critical issue. SABSA is the organization that brings together the South African Business Schools, South African Business Schools Association, and it's an absolute privilege for SABSA to bring this conversation together. And I'd immediately like to hand over to Randall Jonas, the chairman of SABSA, to welcome you. Thank you.
You're on mute, Randall.
Thank you, Mamo. Thank you very much, John, and welcome to everyone all over the country to this very, very important conversation this morning. I just thought I wanted to share a few thoughts from our perspective as SABSA when we consider these issues around corruption and how it affects our craft as academics as well. So, you know, this particular perspective series starts at the time when we are very, very vulnerable as human beings. In the 21st century has gotten off to a very, very cataclysmic start, as you will know, with the attacks on the World Trade Center, the financial scandals, and of course, the COVID-19. So the growing trust gap that we see in government and business has really been paused during the lockdown, but that is likely to change as corruption takes center stage. So it's all about bad news, about bad people. And sadly, it seems there are limitations to ethics because leaders seem to lack the dedication to values and virtues, and they lack the ability to make those ethical decisions and this prompts us really to ask, is corruption a matter of the absence or the failure of governance, or is it greed, which is really the epicenter of the 7 deadly sins? SABSA indeed is proud to host this webinar with Henley Business School and to bring first-class thought leadership on corruption, governance, and ethics. And with that, I hand you over now to Professor Owen Skae, who will be our moderator today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Randall, and welcome everybody to this panel discussion. The topic being corruption, how to keep your business clean and thriving. I'm Owen Skae, I'm the director of Rhodes Business School. I'm also a non-executive director of the Good Governance Academy. And just to briefly mention that this has been established to collaborate globally with business schools, institutions, and universities to share information on critical governance and business science issues as a public good in line with SDG 4, which is education, and SDG 17, which is collaboration. We have an illustrious panel today. Process that we're going to follow is that each panel member will be given 10 minutes to speak. I will then, after that, pose questions to them, and then, time permitting, we'll throw it open for questions on the chat. So just to briefly introduce our panel members who probably need no introduction. But firstly, Professor Mervyn King, who's the chair of the King Code of Corporate Governance, which is now in its 4th version. And Professor King enjoys global stature in the realm of corporate governance. Our second panel member is Ms. Ferial Haffajee, who is the recipient of the 2014 International Press Freedom Award. She's the former editor-in-chief of the Mail and Guardian City Press, and currently is an associate editor at Daily Maverick. And every day, Ferial writes about the rot of corruption. And then last but not least, Professor John Foster-Pedley, who's the Dean and Director at Henley Business School. And John has had a long and illustrious career in business school academia, but he's also a former airline pilot and an aerobatic competitor. So I think those guys pilots who fly Red Bull. So immediately going to hand over to Prof. Mervyn King, who will open. Over to you, Mervyn.
Thank you very much, Owen, for that introduction. Corruption is something which is eating away at our society here in South Africa. And of course, it's not only germane to South Africa. There are other places in the world where corruption is happening. But I want to talk about corruption in the corporate world. We can talk about it for organizations generally, but I want to focus on the corporate world. When in Enron, the corruption appeared with Mr. Skilling and Mr. Lay, Mr. Skilling gave evidence in mitigation that he was a religious man who went to church every Sunday, and he was a good person, and he intended no harm. If I'd been the prosecutor, I would love to have asked him the following question. If you were a guardian of a 10-year-old incapacitated child, would you have done to that child what you did to Enron? And his answer could only have been in the negative. The question would have been directed to the fact that a company is an incapacitated artificial person, perhaps the most important person in general society in South Africa, because the company is the chosen medium through which business is conducted today. But very few people understand the concept of the company being an incapacitated artificial person that has no mind, no heart, no soul, and no conscience. So when something goes wrong or there's some scandal, the wrath of society turns on the company. But when one analyzes the situation, the company is always innocent. It's the question of the conduct of its corporate leaders. Are they conscious corporate leaders who really understand what is going on around them, really understand the issues concerning the company, and really understand that as it started in the 19th century, they were trustees for an incapacitated person. And in the middle of the 19th century, the concept of limited liability was created. There was no concept of what were the duties of a director to a company, but they followed what was very well developed, the guardianship of incapacitated individual human beings, which was good faith, loyalty, care of his or her assets, and planning for him or her short, medium, and long-term skill and diligence. And eventually those became the duties of a director to the company. But what happened in the 20th century, because of some well-known corporate cases, which I won't take up time on them, but it led to a concept of the primacy of the shareholder, that the shareholder was the most important stakeholder. But not only that, because wealthy families had given this equity capital, working capital, to start the business of the company, and yet they were given the protection of limited liability. So they had no duty or responsibility to the company and no responsibility to the company's creditors. They were seen, because the architecture is that the shareholders appoint the directors, and people loosely started calling them the owners of the company. And as we all know, ownership of a person was outlawed 160 years ago when slavery was abolished. It is illegal to own a person. And shareholders don't own the company, they own shares in the company, which entitle them to a conglomeration of very important incorporeal rights. But that's the end of it. The director acting for this incapacitated person has to, in terms of our common law, and now in terms of our new Companies Act, which has taken the common law and put it out into the statute, their duty is to act in the best interest of the company, not any particular stakeholder or shareholder. It's necessary to get these corporate leaders to understand that they must no longer, as was the practice throughout the 20th century, focus on increasing the wealth of shareholders on the basis that that wealth at the top would trickle down to the impoverished at the bottom. It did not happen. The trickle became treacle and it stuck at the top. And eventually it exploded, as you all know, in 2008, that financial capital model underpinned by the primacy of the shareholder. And so we moved, the world moved to a stakeholder model. Take account of the needs, interests, and expectations of all the stakeholders, but make decisions in the long-term best interest of the health of the company. In order to do this in a correct manner, directors need to disabuse their minds of the following corporate sins: greed, grabbing opportunities for oneself or one's family; fear, the fear to make a business judgment call because it might turn out to be wrong and you could be sued as a director. Fear actually can change economies. Sloth, when you really don't understand and you just follow the herd, what the decision is. You're actually failing in your duty to the company. Pride is when you've made a decision and it turns out to be wrong and you take too long to correct it. And then arrogance, when you think your long-term business model for the company is correct and you think your competitor in the marketplace is foolish to be going in a contrary direction instead of asking why. So the critical issue for directors individually, and of course a board acts as a collective mind, is intellectual honesty. The honest application of mind to ensure the decision is the best long-term interest of the health of the company. In order to do this, a director needs to disabuse his or her mind from his or her present needs and past experiences. They've got to disabuse their minds of those corporate sins. They've got to cross that intellectual Rubicon into a space where they are acting with independence of mind in the best interest of this incapacitated person, the company. Now that needs conscious corporate leadership. And conscious leadership is a critical issue. Directors have to understand that they are the conscience of the company. And they need to make those decisions not only for survival of the company, but of course its long-term health. Having passed that Rubicon, that intellectual honesty must be applied even if it causes hardship to any one of the stakeholders. Some people believe today, because we've moved from the primacy of the shareholder to a stakeholder interest model, that a company, the board must act in the interest of stakeholders. That would bankrupt a company, because in acting in the best interest of the company on an intellectually honest basis as conscious corporate leaders, there have to be trade-offs between the various stakeholders. The decision in the interest of the company will benefit one stakeholder more than the other invariably. So intellectual honesty is an absolute critical issue, and it's something difficult to grasp, difficult to practice. One has to actually steel oneself at meetings to make sure that you have disabused your minds of all these issues and you're focusing on this interest of this incapacitated person, the company, which, as I said, is probably the most critical person in society today, because it's the center of creating value for society. Thank you, Owen.
Thank you, Professor King. I immediately hand over to Ferial Haffajee. Ferial?
Thank you very much. Lovely to be with you all. That was a very, it was lovely to hear talk of conscious leadership and the high moral standard, because almost every day we see exactly the opposite. So a little story. Last week, as soon as President Cyril Ramaphosa freed us up to level 2, we decided to take a short left to Durban and drove down there. On the way coming up, the trucks, and I'm sure you've experienced this if you've taken a road trip, but maybe not recently, were for me quite unbelievable. I've usually flown to Durban, so I hadn't experienced this for a long time. And I got to thinking about why this was. And it's a direct link between our economy and state capture, because what we haven't done is move from road to rail and therefore bring down the cost of transport in our economy. One of the big reasons that we're constantly skirting so close to recession, as we're likely to go quite deep into recession. And why is that? That's because of the corruption at Transnet, worth at least 250 billion rand, thanks to the Gupta patronage network. Now that for me wasn't just a story of government or public sector corruption. It really was collusion between the public and private sectors at the highest levels of our economy. It involved, in that case, the company, the global company, McKinsey, Regiments, Trillion, and none of those companies will be the same again. Possibly also the China Construction Bank, and who knows how many other funders. So where was the conscious leadership there? I come to another case. On a polo field somewhere in the Cape Winelands, a man is still enjoying his best life. Or maybe now he's at a pizza joint in Sea Point or the Foreshore. That's where the former Steinhoff CEO Marcus Jooste has been spotted quite regularly. This is not a man who feels the shame of what he's done to many, many people, to many pension funds, pensioners around the world. And so despite running one of the biggest corporate frauds, a massive Ponzi scheme, a global one, justice seems so far away. And I would argue the same for Christo Wiese, this iconic figure in South African corporate life. I know that he has lost a fortune, but I've often asked myself, when he sat on that board with all that knowledge to bear, where was his conscious leadership then? Tongaat Hewlett, exactly the same story. Our economy is also suffering load shedding again at the moment. Before the economy could even barely start up, we were back at level 2 load shedding last week. And if you track back to why that is, it's not because the CEO, Andre de Ruyter, doesn't know what he's doing. He clearly does. Together with Sikonati Manchancha, I think they're part of a real reform team. But such has been the mismanagement and the corruption at Eskom, it's going to take years to fix. And again, when you look there, who are the corporates that were key to arranging the deals? McKinsey, Regiments, Trillion. I could go on and on. At SAA, PwC, and Nkonki, the auditors signed off year after year after year of extremely dodgy accounts. When Dudu Myeni was the chairperson there, they okayed those. What happened? So before I begin to go into my conclusions, back to Durban again. On the skyline is that magnificent Moses Mabhida Stadium. It's reshaped how Durban looks no matter where you are. And that took me back. I realized that it's been 10 years now since that construction cartel and setting of prices came into our consciousness. And again, big stories about how competitive is our economy, how competitive are our corporations. So as I come to my conclusion, what I've come to realize in studying this and covering this for at least a decade now is that there's no such thing as a good private sector and a bad public sector, because often that can be the myth of our national narrative. In fact, what we've learned is that there's a concert of malfeasance and it's conducted by both. One can't work without the collusion of the other. I look at Kimi Makweto, our magnificent Auditor General's reports of various levels of government, and he shows you again and again and again how it's private sector consultants who are signing off the books on innumerable crimes with the public rand. And we can see the impacts of that on rising protests, very poor service delivery. And so what might some of the lessons, for me at least, be as we begin to think back on this disastrous and kleptocratic decade across the private and public sectors? I think we have to separate the auditing and consulting parts of our professional services companies. And I do think that our corporate, our business sector, even our business schools have to be a little bit louder about when executives are caught with their hands in the cookie jar on the wrong side of the law. For example, I read with some horror last week that Len Kona, who was regarded, I've never quite understood why, as the doyen of boards, of corporate governance. Here he had turned up again, this time as a consultant to Minister Lindiwe Sisulu, when I believe Mr. Kona didn't do his work well at Steinhoff and on the many other boards he sat on where many questions have been raised. I do think the JSE needs to be more vigilant. I know that last week, in the past 2 weeks, it has levied quite big fines on EOH and on Tongaat for the quality of their reporting. Internal and external audit functions obviously need a lot of work. I saw last week that Anuj Singh of Eskom and of Transnet Infamy has lost his chartered accountant status. And obviously we need a stronger and a faster national prosecuting authority. The other week I did talk with Shamila Batoy on one of these webinars, which are so popular now. And she said that the place had been completely denuded of any forensic or commercial crime experience. I do think it's going to take years before we see a Steinhoff prosecution happening, Tongaat, etc. And in that gap, for me, it is going to have to be the business sector itself, the corporate sector itself, doing the right thing and freezing out its bad apples far more than we have seen done. I'm also happy Mamo said I should perhaps speak about COVID-19 corruption. We've done a lot of that, and I'm happy, Owen, to take questions on that, but those were just my opening thoughts on the topic posed. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ferial. It's interesting that you concluded talking about bad apples. There's the ABC, the bad apple, the bad bushel, and the bad crop. I think we might argue that South Africa is in the realm of the bad crop. So on that note, I hand over to Professor Foster-Pedley for his observations. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Owen, and thank you very much, Mervyn and Ferial. It's actually phenomenal for me to be sitting here with two people I really respect and have taught me a lot. Mervyn, from the point of view of thinking clearly, corporate governance, being able to take the high view and take a broad systemic understanding, and to have the clarity and discipline of mind to master oneself. And Ferial, who is holding the light for the investigative journalists who are in the face of great attack and personal danger sometimes, are telling us all what's really going on. So thank you. I'd just like to say thank you to both of you for the work you've done. So I'm an educator, and as you say, an ex-airline pilot, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment, because I think it's relevant, because captains of aircraft used to systematically, or rather through error, crash their airplanes. And unfortunately, captains of industry are crashing their companies as well. And I think some of the methods to stop one crashing airplanes can be used to stop the other crashing their companies. We'll get to that. But I mean, I'm fascinated as an educator how to change the game. What levers do you pull to change this dynamic? Because you can teach about corruption, it doesn't stop people being corrupt. So the challenge is that it's the story we have in our minds that I think dictates how our reason works. That's what Yuval Noah Harari talks about in his books. And that's what you can see in sort of climate denial, fake science, in the supporters, forgive me, of Trump, who are willing to justify anything with deep rationality based on fundamentally, for some of us, crazy thoughts. How can somebody think like that? But the fact is that the mind is driven by stories, whether they're religions or the thought of capitalism, or the thought of the corporation, or the thought of the nation, or the thought of the party. Those stories dictate, make reason become servant to them. So there's a few elements for me that we need to do in attacking corruption. The classic thing is we attack the devil, and that devil is that person out there who is somehow not us. I remember I was leading a trade mission for the British government once into Ghana, and the High Commissioner told me when I met the Prime Minister that he said, look, John, you really got to say something about the increasing corruption in the timber sector. Us British are not very keen on it. It's affecting our trade. So I said this to the Prime Minister. I said, we're worried about the increasing corruption in the timber sector, Prime Minister. And he gave me a very kind of world-weary look of my naivety and said, Mr. Foster-Pedley, it takes two to corrupt. And I was working for one of the largest corporations in the UK then, which was later fined £500 million for corrupt dealings in arms deal in Saudi, which was baffling to me. And it took me close to understand what corruption really feels like when you start to see it nearby. So I think there's a few C's, you know, there's corruption, collusion, and capture. They're all things we need to deal with. And there's some other C's. Consequence. Who pays for corruption? And I think one of the problems of describing corruption as an abstract institutional is that there's no story about it. The story is too high level in a sense. It's not visceral enough. It's virtual, not visceral. So who feels corruption really? It's the poor. We live in a country with the highest Gini coefficient. Those people are trapped in there. The people who suffer most are the people who are trapped in there and can't get the opportunity for education, for housing, for confidence even in themselves, and who make the wrong sort of heroes of the people who become rapidly rich, not understanding that that money has come from their opportunities and their children's future. We need to tell that story differently. We need to show the consequence and the causality. The other thing is that often in corporate life, the limit of your causality, I think, is at the limit of your company. Is it your stakeholders or your shareholders, particularly your shareholders, and around profit and the company itself? And so consequences that are happening further down the line, societal or pollution or corrupt consequences, are not thought through. They don't come to mind in the same way. They're slightly out there. We're not training people to think deep causality. We're thinking limited causality based on the story we hold. The corporation is another C, and Mervyn's talked enormously ably about that. Thank you so much. Colin Mayer, who wrote a book called Prosperity, was the Dean of Said Business School a while ago. And his approach is to revise, to really think about how can corporate law be changed in particular ways to change the focus of a company from profit to purpose. We often say that the purpose of a company is to make money, and that's extended in the sort of Milton Friedman doctrine that to make money for the shareholders without causing societal harm, but of course we don't see far enough. But he would say that's not the purpose of a company. The purpose of a company is the purpose of your company, whatever that is. Profit is there to sustain, drive, pay off people who invest in it, but their purpose is never profit. In fact, it's prosperity that is a noble aim of companies, is to provide value for people into society so society lifts. And so we cannot live with a bad Gini coefficient. And that takes us to another C, which is the nature of capitalism as we see it. And that is under siege at the moment in its classic ways. What do we mean by capitalism, and how does law change? And again, Mervyn and Ferial have done so much work in addressing that. I think what we're looking at here is a movement. It's a lot of these things are done by people in corporations where they're self-inflicted damage, they're self-unconscious, self-deluding, self-justifying, and the story hijacks their reason. We need to create a movement which is cross society, which pulls many levers to change our perspective and shine light on what's happening. In flying, we had a state we called airmanship. And airmanship was the ability to hold a consciousness in mind that was scanning the environment at all phases and never being focused on the levers and dials in front of yourself. And you had to deliberately force people to look widely and think about that so they could see what's going around. We need to do that in many ways as well, because the cost of these massive corrupt practices is huge. I mean, Madoff Ponzi scheme was $68 billion. That's somebody's money. VW emissions was around 30 billion. The Carillion mismanagement recently was 900 million pounds with a 700 million pensions deficit. LIBOR was about $88 billion in fines, plus around $176 billion in investor losses. Steinhoff, I mean, you would know Ferial, I know it's a 30 billion loss. There's probably a lot more. Those are people, that's people's money. And these people are not just mindless investors, they're pension funds, they're real people. And I think we have to tell that story with more impact and more determination. Because there are a number of consequences, the direct value. If you have a corrupt company, if you're those people who find out, not only does your international brand value collapse, but your company and brand value collapses too. Your personal reputations are damaged forever. You lose revenue and clients and stock values and careers and jobs. Employees go, investors go, suppliers suffer. It's a whole value chain you're dealing with. And those are the challenges. And the indirect value destruction is opportunities taken from the uneducated poor and the educated, the cost and quality of service delivery. You go through a municipality that you know is corrupt, and you look at the roads, you can't hardly see when you're driving down the roads because there's no cat's eyes and there's no lights and you can't see anything, and people are overtaking and there's no way. People are dying because the money is being mismanaged. Adding costs to contracts, hidden taxes, multiplier effect of taking money out of the economy so that can't be reused. Roads, hospitals, housing are damaged, and effective entrepreneurs never getting the contracts they should get because tenderpreneurs are giving it to people they know who can't do the jobs and inflate the costs, create low quality results. And so there's this multiplier negative effect. I think what we're facing now is an opportunity for us to break through the sort of shades of gray of ignorance, denial, people turning a blind eye, actively colluding or proactive corruption, and then moving into systemic state capture. I think we need to shine the light on this and make it a national movement across all parties, not to just stigmatize the poor and make one evil hero, because I believe we're all part of this. We're all in some sense colluding. And I think the painful thing is that when we see we are in some ways, and what we need to do is understand that we can change the consequences by example, by encouraging people to step up, by putting your money and support behind the people who are speaking out, and by putting your time and effort into creating a new and different approach to framing what corruption is. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So, Mervyn, a question to you. People are skeptical and cynical right now. And I think we want to bring us down to practicalities, brass tacks. How do you have a clean and thriving business when you see all this going on? Criticism is leveled at King 4 Code. We've got the Companies Act. We've got anti-money laundering. People are able to move money through bank accounts. They never get caught. But the average person in the street, every time they want to get a new cell phone, they have to be featured. There's a disconnect. And I think that it's very tough for the average person or the small business who's trying to get their business going, seeing that I just do one little thing and people come down on me like a ton of bricks. But because you got the big payback, you've got the money in the bank account that's already gone, you can get the best lawyers to defend you. How can we put any faith in our system of corporate governance in South Africa today?
Well, of course, one mustn't conflate the law with governance. Governance is guidance as to how to direct and how to manage. And recently there were articles written where that conflation took place. The Steinhoff case was heard by the Gauteng High Court and gave a judgment similar to the Supreme Court of Appeal in the African Bank case, which is the following. The question was a legal one. Who was the correct plaintiff? Because what had happened was that shareholders had sued the directors for breach of duty of care. Well, the law is quite clear that the directors owe their duty of care to the company and not to the shareholder or any other stakeholder. So the correct person to sue when there's loss or diminution in value is the company. But of course, the company can only act through its board. And if that board of directors makes a decision that, no, they didn't act negligently, they didn't breach their duty, the company doesn't sue. The law is not an ass. The law then says the shareholders can sue as if they were the company. And if they recover from the directors, the money goes to the company. And the company, because the doctrine of limited liability, has to first settle all the creditors, and the shareholders who have no liability to the creditors are at the back of the queue. And if there's any surplus, they then get that surplus, the same as on liquidation. So one must be careful not to conflate legal issues with governance itself. And I'm afraid the question of consequences, because that's really your question, Owen, is what Ferial has been touching on. During the last 10 or 12 years, our institutions such as the NPA has been hollowed out. I mean, one of the concepts and drivers of the state capture was to hollow out those who could act and there'd be consequences for their conduct. So they hollowed out SARS, they hollowed out the NPA, they hollowed out all the investigative units. And the consequence was that they virtually were untouchable. And so you're correct that the man in the street sees these things going wrong. But it's because of the lack of skills in our institution, because of that state capture. And the whole purpose of that was to hollow out the skills so that they would in effect be untouchable and to put their own puppets in the place, their deployment as it was called. So there are no consequences because, as Ferial said, speaking to Batoy, she's been hamstrung by the fact that she's lost a lot of skills. And it's going to take time to rebuild those skills. I think the prosecution of people in Steinhoff is going to be a virtual impossibility by our national prosecuting authorities because of the forensic skills. I just know in my practice at the bar, I defended many so-called alleged corporate fraudsters. I never lost one of those cases, not because I was a great barrister. It's because the prosecutors didn't understand corporate law. They were trained on criminal matters and criminal crime, physical crimes such as murder, rape, assault, etc., but no understanding of corporate issues. And if you think that was the position over the last 40 years, well, and the UK, for example, overcomes that by actually briefing barristers at the bar who are skilled in corporate matters to prosecute. Our system doesn't allow that, and I think it should. Of course, there's costs involved. But I'm afraid our people, our institutions that can have the consequences that John and you were talking about tacitly in your question are not going to happen because the institutions to implement those consequences have been hollowed out from a skills point of view.
Ferial, question to you. And as a professor at the London School of Economics called Michael Mutakrishna, I also draw on the work of Dan Ariely, a professor of behavioral economy, as well as Professor Philip Zimbardo, the Lucifer effect. Now, Michael Mutakrishna has done some gaming, and what he shows, sadly, is that bribery and corruption is embedded in our DNA as human beings. And that when corruption enters into a system, it's like a virus. It just takes over. And in fact, your own profession has not been immune to this. So how should journalism spotlight this so that the kind of movement that John is talking about can get galvanized, that you're having to address the deficiencies due to the hollowed out factors that Mervyn has spoken to?
So Owen, thank you. But I can't agree with that Hobbesian view of the world. I mean, I'd love to get the names of the authors you spoke about. I cannot believe that that being corrupt and misappropriating the public rand is intrinsic to the human condition. As a fellow human, I just can't. I think that you can hollow out institutions, you can break them, and that's how nations fail. But I have to believe in the power of the good. And to have watched how our society galvanized to basically get rid of the kleptocratic government of President Jacob Zuma, because that was not about Cyril Ramaphosa winning an ANC election. That was about a movement of people saying we've had enough. And some of us went to the Treasury to link hands around it in order to protect it when that weekend special finance minister was put in place. And I have to believe that that is a fundament of our country. Why we won't be a Mali or a Zimbabwe is because we have that intrinsic opposition to the bad. And yes, at the moment, I think most municipalities are in poor hands and the systems, the patronage networks are quite entrenched. But I have to believe that I'm seeing a new kind of movement developing. Yesterday, the Nelson Mandela Foundation, all the big foundations of our elders went to Luthuli House and said, we've had enough. We're going to do another movement against corruption. And this weekend, I think, is going to be a vital one to see how much power President Cyril Ramaphosa has to carry through on his 7-page letter, which is quite an amazing document if you read the fine print of it. But I don't think he can do it alone. And for me, where I think business has really dropped the ball, Owen, in the past couple of years, is to think, okay, now we have this great moral president, this man who understands business, and that he will be a messiah or a savior. That's wrong. I think it's going to demand that all of us remain active citizens like we were when we got rid of that awful era, and to at least live with hope, for me, is vital. I see there's a question I want to take about directors, and it was about from Carolyn Chalmers on the Len Kona statement. Many people get very angry because Mr. Len Kona is like this iconic governance figure, a little bit like Professor Mervyn King. But I do think he and the other big names on the Steinhoff board, you had Steve Boysons of ABSA, you had Johan van Zyl of Sanlam, you had various of our Christo Wiese. I think that there's an essay or a dissertation to be written on what happened there, because when I have had space to question them, they say, well, we just took what KPMG gave us, the accounts that were given to us. But I do think that governance requires deeper thinking and deeper consideration when you saw the Steinhoff story, because if you look at what the German prosecutors found, it didn't take that much digging to see what had happened there. And then I wish we could be a little bit more like Germany, because if you see how quickly the Wirecard prosecutions have happened, that's been pretty amazing. Where here, I think it's going to, like Prof says, it's going to take years for Steinhoff and Tonga to really get before the courts in any significant way.
Thanks, Ferial. I mean, you talk about Steinhoff. You mentioned earlier about business schools doing more. You know, I've
Yes.
written quite a lot about Steinhoff, as well as USB. So, you know, it's not that the business schools are silent on this. We actually, but to John now. John, just to put some facts down. Sandile Zungu from the Black Business Council, she recently was quoted as saying corruption in SA is being on steroids. Ferial's colleague, Marion Merton, wrote in the Daily Maverick on the 20th of August that the SIU is investigating 5.08 billion in relation to PPE procurement, which is just over half of what was spent on COVID-19. We've mentioned today Steinhoff, Tongaat, Hewlett, Eskom, etc. Practically, how are you going to get this movement going? And again, what does it mean for people that want to have a clean business that survives and thrives in this bad crop? If truth be told, that's what it is.
Well, I'm very glad to hear Sandile say that. I'm delighted to say he was one of my better MBA students in the day. And so well done him. And he's doing a good job. Look, for me, it's, if you want to start a movement going, it's not just railing from the streets and being emotional. I study movements. I've been looking at Extinction Rebellion, not because I particularly like Extinction Rebellion per se, but the rationale behind creating movements was reasonably well thought out, although it's probably imploding now. So creating movements that cross corporate and cross governments that energize people is an art. We're not in a fight, and I think we'd love to believe it's a gentlemanly fight. So why I agree with Ferial, by the way, about good. but there are plenty of people who get suborned by the wrong. And if you're a criminal, you get very good at criminality. And it can't be opposed with lack of insight and lack of skills. We're simply not ruthless enough. And I don't mean ruthless in terms of killing people. I mean, we're in a war, not a fight. And we need to get the weapons together to systematically oppose that. Where's the opposition coming from? Absolutely from the free press, absolutely from the work that that's been done so brilliantly by Mervyn. But what's not being energized are the people. The people need to understand what's going on with them. That's the force we need to start mobilizing, so people understand that corruption is destroying their children's future. We need to explain that, be explicit, provide facts, provide stories, do it graphically, do it in videos, we need to have an absolutely obsessive movement to tell people how this is really affecting. Then you will see a grassroots changing. You'll see the shift of power, the shift of narrative moving. You'll see more people stepping out. And I think business schools are not about case studies per se, although that's important. Business schools are about energizing activity, about if a business school is doing any good, shouldn't it be making a difference in the world in which it sits? That's why, and that difference has to be actively reducing the Gini coefficient, allowing people to grow and develop, getting people the skills so they can build an economy. It's not an abstract intellectual freedom project. It's a project of activism, and that's how I believe the business schools together should come together to work, and we should be helping every aspect of that, giving free scholarships and free resources into the MPA and other resources that have been stripped out. We should be doing everything we can to put skills into the places they're needed.
I'm going to just throw some questions now that have been posted on the chat and others that have been emailed to us. Now, one question that came was around citizens taking responsibility. The person that posed this question said, if you continually vote for one political party, they become complacent. And the question is, you can't hold these leaders to account. So what do we need to do about holding leaders to account, particularly when they refuse to be held to account? Who would like to pick up on that question?
I could have a go at the political part of it, at least, Owen. So what we have in our country, not a single party state, but a massive single party majority state, which makes the ANC far less accountable than it should be, just because it gets such unassailable majorities. And I'm greatly saddened to see that our opposition parties have never done that thing which they've spoken about for years, which is to build a united front in order to create a system that's a little bit more competitive, a politically competitive system. But what was interesting for me as I've begun to report this week is one of the reasons behind that 7-page letter from the president is that the ANC started getting very worried about this hashtag on social media called #FootsackANC. They began to worry that their numbers could go down. And I suspect they have some research showing that the COVID-19 corruption has really hurt the reputation of the party. And for me, that's a good thing, is where social media can be a good, it can equally be detrimental to democracies, as we've seen in the US election in 2016. But in our country, at least, it seems to be having a cautionary effect on the governing party. And that's a good thing. How do we hold them to account? I can only tell you my own story in Mayfair, where my mom lives, and it's a DA-run ward, but really in appalling condition for such a beautiful historical area, is to become part of your ward committees, to make your voice heard, and to begin to know, like you said, John, to know your local budgets well, apply resources to it, and keep people informed about what changes they should be seeing and how that money is being spent. That's a really big job, and very sadly we have no local media anymore. If no local press, most local newspapers have closed, and there hasn't been websites or online news sites to take their place in order to do that vital ground level work, because that's where the corruption, where the rubber really hits the road. I mean, sometimes there's no road. If you see Standerton today, it's a burning mess. Huh?
Mervyn, a question to you. Somebody asked, if the NPA is hollowed out, why should there not be space for private prosecution? And I think one could extend that to say, if business is truly committed, surely they could create a fund. The auditing profession could create a fund for private prosecution. And in there, the issue is around putting your money where your mouth is, and what does it mean to go after the kingpins who seem to continue to just get away with this and are never brought to justice?
Owen, the private sector is perfectly willing to prosecute. And as you know, Gerrie now left the state prosecution and joined a private prosecution unit. But in order to launch a private prosecution, you need a nolle prosequi, Latin for the government agreeing not to prosecute. Now, to get that nolle prosequi, you've got to overcome huge bureaucratic hurdles. And if a government refuses to give you that permission to prosecute, that's an end of the matter. Your only remedy is to take it on review to a court to show that refusal to prosecute, to give you the right to prosecute, was irrational. So you've got to take it on review. Private people cannot prosecute without getting a certificate called a nolle prosequi from the NPA and from the Department of Justice that you can, as a private person, prosecute. Otherwise, the state has the monopoly on prosecution. So although private prosecutors are very willing to prosecute, and I gave the example in Steinhoff, I think there'd be many private institutions who would give money for barristers to actually prosecute in that case. But I don't think the state will give up its right of prosecution. It keeps talking about it's investigating. And that would be the answer if you try to get a nolle prosequi from the state now. They'll say it's in hand, we're investigating. But I'm afraid which investigators are investigating the investigators, because the skills, the forensic skills in the NPA are absent. They might be in the private sector, but they cannot act until they get permission from the monopolistic control of prosecution, which the state has by way of legislation.
John, a personal question that came from somebody who says, you know, in my community, I know that my next door neighbor is involved in corrupt activities. I've spoken to this person about it, and they say, look, I need to survive. And in fact, if I opt out of the system, I get chucked away in any case. So these systemic issues, we know that whistleblowers, very often the whistleblower is the one that gets chucked out of the organization and even has to leave the country. We've had potential whistleblowers have been murdered. Again, how do we actually have the courage to do what needs to be done? And those people who speak out in organizations about this often sidelined. It's career limiting. You sit on a social and ethics committee, nobody actually pays too much attention to you at the end of the day.
One of the things we teach at business schools is systems thinking. And what that does is differentiate between the 1,000 things you could do to the tens of things that would probably help to the 5 things that in conjunction with a couple of others are deeply, deeply changing, the big levers. So if you've got a neighbor who's corrupt, are you never, I mean, are we all clean? You know, have we never done anything, whether it's speeding to paying a traffic cop or whatever it is? So if we start looking to our own hearts, some people say absolutely not. Others would say yes, at some time in my life, you know, I'm tainted. So you can attack your neighbor, and it's probably very good to learn to speak out. There are very interesting ways to do this. Like, I'm not attacking you. I understand it's not you I'm talking, but this behavior has these consequences and I don't endorse it. But what we need to find out is what are the big levers we need to pull and how can we do them? So protecting whistleblowers is an absolutely critical thing to work on. It's going to be difficult. But beyond that, we have to think about who do we support. So if you look at a political party that is in power and then you reject the ANC for the DA or the EFF or whoever, what are we doing? Those parties are so disparate and they're so conflicted, and there's such a delicate balance of opposing forces. I think we have to do what the French say is tenir le nez, hold a nose, and whether you support that party or not, support the people within it. And if that in that case is Ramaphosa and the people around him, find ways to support him and those people who are talking in that language in as many ways as you can, publicly, in support, in financial support and other things, so that that faction grows within the party. What we have to do is help people find the big levers, communicate them, and give them the way in which they can make a difference. And again, I have to say that in the COVID environment, we talk about personal protective equipment and vaccination, medical vaccination. How to save ourselves in COVID is personal protective behaviors and social vaccination by changing the habits of people, deep behavioral understandings and habits. And that's what we did in flying. We developed methods in the cockpit to challenge captains. So that pace, we would say, probe when something's going on. So we're going a little too fast. Should you sign off that audit? Don't get a response. Alert, we're going a little bit too slow now. We're going to stall and maybe crash. If you sign off that audit, we're leaving this issue unexplored. No response, you don't go to sea. You challenge. If you sign off them, if we don't increase our speed now, we're all going to die, and it's going to be a disaster. If you sign off that audit, it's going to sink our company. But the final one in this PACE, P-A-C-E, is emergency. And in flying, you say, Captain, you're going to crash this airplane. I have control. And the captain has to cede control. And we have no equivalent of the E of PACE in corporate life. It's very hard for a junior person to say, I have control. That's why you need whistleblowers. You need the free press. You need the people who stand up for corporate activism. So what we did in flight crew cockpits was lower the power distance, not too low, so it was sort of anarchistic with no decision making, but lower it from there to there. And that's what we need to do in boardrooms, by a collective set of activities to change the dynamics and raise the consciousness and conscience of people who are making these decisions, and activate people so they know what's going on, so the pressure is on people from all sides.
Professor King.
Owen, can I just add to the whistleblowing discussion?
Of course.
The problem in South Africa, in my judgment, is that our whistleblowing legislation is fragmented. There's something about whistleblowing in the Labour Relations Act. It's in the Companies Act. It's in the Corrupt Practices Act. There should be one whistleblowing act. In none of the acts that I've mentioned, is there any clause, any particular section encouraging whistleblowing. So there's no encouragement clause. And then there's no praiseworthy clause. There's no clause which says John Brown, who's a whistleblower, becomes a praiseworthy member of society, language of that nature. There's no encouragement to blow whistles, and there's no praise for whistleblowing in any of this fragmented legislation. For years, I've been advocating to take all this fragmented legislation, which actually doesn't help protect also the whistleblower, doesn't encourage it, and have one piece of legislation that has encouragement and praise in that legislation. And it's a huge weakness in our legislation.
So we are scheduled to stop at 12:30, but the panelists have all agreed that they're happy to stay on for longer. So we'll just keep going and deal with some of the questions that come. So I think the plan is we'll carry on for another 15 minutes. So if you're enjoying it, please stay. Mervyn, somebody posted a question which was quite long, which I'll paraphrase, but I think it resonates with a related question that somebody has posed. And that is that you talk about directors acting in the best interest of the company, but there's the legal and the moral obligation. So for example, if a company does something that, or you as an employee do something that they don't like, they then have got the full armory of everything behind them. And that means that that single individual, there's not much that they can do, because you're fighting over matters of legal principle, protecting interests of the company, when in fact there's a moral issue. Now, we talk about paying as little tax as possible. Now, it's legally in the best interest of, it's in the best interest of the company to do that, and it's perfectly legal, but is it morally right? So you have Apple paying very low tax, you have Starbucks paying very low tax. Again, it questions the basis of acting in the best interest of the company when it appears to be at odds with a moral obligation. And how does one reconcile that?
Okay, the question of a policy of taxation was never an issue for board discussion. It was a backroom arithmetical calculation according to the judgments of the high courts of every country in existence, that an entity is perfectly entitled to arrange his or her affairs to avoid paying as little tax, to avoid paying as much tax as possible. So avoidance is perfectly lawful. Evasion is another issue. But because of transfer pricing, companies like Apple operating in South Africa, using our infrastructure, for which all of us as South African citizens pay tax to support, because of transfer pricing, they use our infrastructure and they transfer the profits out to, let's say, a jurisdiction which is a tax haven. Well, this has caused moral outrage in society. The consequence is that a company that does that, it starts impacting on reputation. The makeup of the market cap of companies today is only about 20% of the market cap of a company is made up of additives in a balance sheet according to financial reporting standards. The other 80% is the so-called non-financial aspects, and one of the most important is reputation. And in acting in the best interest of the company, from a governance point of view, boards today are considering tax policy. Are we paying the amount of tax which society, our customer base, our stakeholders would be happy that we paying our fair whack, having regard to our participation in this community? So tax policy is something that is considered by boards today, to pay a fair amount of taxation having regard to how they operate in a country in which they exist. So that has changed completely. Reputation is an asset of the company. It's probably the most important asset. And boards have a duty to protect that asset as they protect the plant and machinery. But it's an intangible asset, but it's absolutely critical. A company loses its reputation, it loses its market share. It's as simple as that. It loses customer support. So directors, those conscious corporate leaders, and one of the reasons for my starting the Good Governance Academy, Owen, was because of my travels around the world and lecturing and talking and being connected with business schools and institutions around the world. I learned that the thought leadership on teaching things such as tax morality has changed completely and has different thoughts and leadership styles in various countries. So the teaching of accountancy, for example, in various countries has changed completely. It's not only teaching about the double entry bookkeeping system, it's teaching about, some of the universities are teaching philosophy to accountancy students because they want them to think laterally as advisors. Why? Because artificial intelligence will take over the drudgery of double entry bookkeeping. And you can press a button and get a balance sheet almost on a daily basis. So your questioner doesn't realize that these are assets of the company and directors have a duty to protect those assets. So the question of taxation is a critical issue pertaining to reputation.
Ferial, a question to you. In the world of investigative journalism, I think that some people see incredibly courageous journalists in South Africa. The work that Paulie van Wyk has done, for example. I don't specifically want to highlight her, but you know who these journalists are. But are journalists themselves sufficiently skilled to unravel the intricacies of corporate hieroglyphics? And what could be done better? And perhaps there's a role for business schools to play with the journalism profession that we could find ways to work together to build capacity so that investigative journalism can do their job a lot quicker, which is to get to the rot and expose it and spotlight it.
Sure. That's a really lovely question. So Foley is an outlier along with our Amabunganis and along with Peter Louis Myberg, my colleague at the Daily Maverick. And that is forensic work they undertake. So a single investigation can take 6 to 8 months to track, to put that credit card used by Julius Malema and link it directly to the defrauding of the VBS bank. It's intricate work. And I suppose what we are playing with, Owen, at the Daily Maverick is how our community of insiders, these are the people who support us, all of whom are highly skilled, how they can help us fast track some of that forensic work. So my particular interest at the moment is to link, like you said, John, the corruption at PRASA to the transport experience of commuters who either pay very high taxi fares or are always late at work because the signaling systems on our railways are so bad. And so to get our audience involved in simple things, be it going to take pictures of the local station, see what you're supposed to have, to the more difficult work of reading the books, of doing the forensic tracing to understand what happened to the PRASA budget. And there's big room for the specialists at business schools or for really skilled people to assist investigative journalism, because last year Maverick, Amabungani and News 24, they won the Global Shining Light Award for their work on the Gupta leak set of emails, on making those clear to us and bringing them to the front of public consciousness. And I think that kind of work deserves all the support it can get.
John, business schools teach leadership, but often what I find is that you're doing leadership development programs, the CEO comes and gives a 1-minute pep talk and you never see the CEO again. It's almost as if these things have been delegated lower down. Do you really think that that senior leadership in South Africa is really immersing themselves in what intellectual engagement we need around intellectual honesty, conscious capitalism, responsible business practice?
It's a tricky question, isn't it? Because it's got a number of assumptions. What is leadership? Is it that thing that is the corporate body? Or is it the next layer down? Or that entity we call leadership we vest in individuals? And they're enormously powerful. Just going back to the point of helping the journalists, we actually have a Sol Plaatje scholarship now, which we offer for people who've been speaking truth to power and to maverick journalists, etc. We want to double or triple that so that we can help build that up. But I think leaders are people. They're stuck in a story and they're in tricky situations. We have almost godlike expectations of leaders, and sometimes not enough expectations. I think leaders convene and create meaning, and create direction, and create purpose, and set examples. To expect them to be the only ones to make things happen, which is not what you're saying in your question, but to expect them to do that would be another way where we let go of our own agency, where we don't see that. Well, I think what Mervyn talked about is the corporate devil that's in all of us, where we understand that we could be that person too. So I think that we have to help leaders frame the argument. We have to help leaders understand beyond the boundaries of their obligations to the company, to the obligations of their children. Because when we talk about an abstract like the country, it's actually their children and their children's children they're talking about, their future. We have to frame it in ways that resonate. We'll find that people in leadership positions, particularly corporate positions, are obviously enormously bright people. They really are, but they're bright within the service of their organization. I think this story of governance and what we're trying to do needs to be spread out to be something away from corporate and away from just government into the lives we live and the quality of lives we need to exist in. And we need to explain why corporate governance is something that matters to all of us and our children. I think the people who can do that easily and make the story accessible and reachable and vivid and resonant, they're the leaders that are coming up. So maybe the corporate leaders aren't the real leaders here. Certainly in the military, we would talk about, the emergent leaders, the situational leaders, the ones who step forward in the moment. And maybe we should be looking at those leaders and energizing them as well, because they will capacitate those corporate leaders who will perhaps follow. Like Gandhi said, I must leave because my people have gone and I'm their leader. So maybe we should lead for them.
As we come to the last 5 minutes, I'll just give each panel member an opportunity to wrap up 1.5 minutes, a concluding comment. But perhaps, Mervyn, there was more interest in the whistleblowing, and somebody asked, even if there's no legislative protection, is there some kind of social mechanism where whistleblowers would be acknowledged for the good work that they do?
Well, of course, that's a movement in society itself. Shareholder activism is yesterday's activism. Civil society activism has become the activism which should really concern directors today. And that is because the ESG part of accountability has become more important than the financial side. And so people have to think differently. But society, as I said, one needs legislation where you have encouragement and praise in that legislation. And it's missing from all this fragmented pieces of legislation. We need one piece of legislation to do it, which I think might start encouraging society to give status to whistleblowers. Because a lot of whistleblowers are rejected because some of his or her peers get affected as a result of the blowing of the whistle. And so I think there should be one piece of legislation. But just you asked me to round up, I think it's very important, and that's why I started the Good Governance Academy, because of my realization of the importance of teaching about conscious corporate leadership and understanding that these corporate leaders are the conscience of the company. And society's wrath shouldn't be turned against the company, it should be turned against those human beings who are the mind, soul, and conscience of the company. And we are starting to teach that at our business schools, and the Good Governance Academy, as all of you know, we are distributing on quite a regular basis presentations that are done.
We'll just give Prof. King's connection a chance to come back again, so please stay with us. If it doesn't, we'll go to Ferial. Ferial, you can pick up your conclusion. Thanks.
Thanks, Owen. Just to say to high five whistleblowers, Mandy Wiener's got a great book coming out which just does that, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And then also Cynthia Stimple, who was the amazing whistleblower at SAA, the head of treasury there. She's the person who blew the whistle that eventually led to, I think, Dudamieni being declared a delinquent director. She's bringing out a book. So until we get the legislation right, I think there's other ways in which we can, certainly as the media, make more of the role of the bravery of whistleblowers in the fight against corruption. And then just, I suppose, my final thought is, I don't believe in saviors anymore. So when we hear ourselves saying, if only Cyril did this, actually it is about civil society activism and each of us being active citizens against corruption. And thank you for a lovely discussion, Owen.
Thanks, Ferial. And John, the last word with you.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you very much for moderating this. And thank you, Ferial, for your comments. And thank you very much for your work. It's been a privilege being on a panel with you, and to Mervyn as well, and to SABSA. I remember that picture. I think I saw it in a nature program of those red ants coming to a small stream, and they couldn't cross, and then they started making a platform across the stream until eventually they crossed. I think what we're doing with activism here is not one big committee talking about activism, I think we need to create a movement. And the secret about movements is that you can't want to be successful. You may fail. You may be the one who drowns at the bottom of that. We're creating something for everybody else here, for South African society. And you may not succeed in your activism or what we choose to do, and you may not be very adept at it, but we have to do it. So we have to reframe what good citizenship means. And maybe within corporate governance, we say that being a good citizen becomes incredible, at least provide normative pressure, social pressure, as well as rules to make people do that. So let's be a red ant, and get the movement going.
Thanks, John. Mervyn, thanks for coming back again. So you can wrap up. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry. Well, the wrap up is that we need conscious corporate leaders, and the purpose of the GGA, at least over the next 10 years, is to hopefully get people coming out of business schools. And last year, there were about 17,000 MBAs, about 8,000 masters, and a couple of hundred PhDs. So if you take that at around about 25,000 over 10 years, we'll have 250,000 being taught about conscious corporate leadership and acting in the best interest of an incapacitated person, and not out of self-interest, and not with fear, and not with arrogance, all the things that I've mentioned. These are critical issues, and we can get that across, and teaching it to people. And what I'm finding is not only we teaching it to young people, but my peers as well in the business world are starting to appreciate and understand. They have to think differently. And so I'm encouraging them, for example, to get millennials on their board. People talk of diversity, but forget about intergenerational diversity. We need millennials on our boards to help us think. And then I'm encouraging boards to also have the Z generation, who are in their early 20s. They think differently from the millennials even. The millennials had to learn about social media. The Z generation were born with social media in their mouths. So they think differently, and you enter into a contractual arrangement with them of non-disclosure and good faith, and you register their names, for example, with the Institute of Directors. If they breach that, well, they'll never get appointed as a director in their lives. But you have an issue that you discuss, a business judgment call, and you then discuss it with your millennials, and you feel there's something more, you discuss it with your Z generation people. And I found 6, 7 times out of 10, you get another thinking, you come back and you can make a better business judgment call, which fits in with the society of today. And let me just conclude by saying, what really concerns the Z generation and the millennials is climate change. To them, this pandemic is something temporal. It will pass, and it will. But in the next 30, 40 years, 50 years, when they've got grandchildren, if we don't get, you can isolate from the pandemic, you can social distance, you can wear masks. None of those are remedies against climate change. So you've got to think, the director has to be a trapeze artist in the next 2 years, because you've got to think short-term survival. And that's how I've coined the word coronanomics, because people have to think it's an economic issue and it's a viral issue. So it's a coronanomics crisis that directors have to get their minds around for short-term survival, but not forgetting they've got to get that business model right to deal with that long-term situation of climate change, which is going to impact on all our businesses. Of course, it will impact on infrastructure. So conscious corporate leadership is absolutely critical. Thank you.
So I'd just like to say thank you to excellent panel members. Really made my task as moderator very easy. Certainly a lot of food for thought. Even I learned something today. So I hope we all managed to learn something and take away whatever movement we start, whether we're pushing back against the bad crop, and the whole idea about being conscious about what we're doing and ensuring that our institutions are protected. I think that's the most important thing, so that they can go and do the good sustainable work that they need to do. Thank you to SABSA for driving this perspective. Thank you to Henley for hosting us. And I think thanks to Ann Wilson, Mama Disa, the team at Henley, everybody who put this together. And this is the start of many more perspectives to come, I'm sure. So, Mama, can I hand it back to you now? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Owen, and thank you to all our speakers for such an insightful and thought-provoking session. We've got another one next week, SABSA Perspectives on COVID-19 and Livelihoods. I'll share the link for registration in the chat should you wish to attend. Same time at 11:30, we have our next SABSA Perspectives should you wish to join us next week. And over to you, John, for closing us out. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to say that the next week one on COVID will not be about COVID per se. It'll be how do you be successful in a low touch economy, in a distance economy. It's going to give a strategic overview of different sectors internationally, of how they've adapted their strategies to the new world, how they're continuing to adapt for the likelihood of carrying on in this sort of low touch economy for the next while. And we're going to, I hope, have an international speaker, which SABSA has kindly created the platform for. So thank you very much for the privilege of hosting this, and thank you very much, Mamo, for your work. I know you put an awful lot into it. And thank you, Anne, and particularly thank you to all the participants for showing up, because it was you who made it happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Mama. Thank you. Thank you, Owen.
Thanks, everyone, and thank you, Owen. Thank you, and have a good
Thank you,
afternoon.
everyone.